Winter of 1887 came down on the Fraser Canyon like a fist. Lenora Baird had 4 potatoes left in the root cellar, a half-frozen bucket of oats, and 2 younger brothers who hadn't stopped shivering since Tuesday. The woodpile on the east side of the cabin was down to splinters and good intentions. She had been rationing the oats since the first snowfall, stretching a day's worth into 3 by adding creek water and a handful of dried clover she'd saved from September. Her brothers didn't complain. That was what frightened her most. Their father, Gerald Baird, had been dead 11 weeks. A logging accident up near Lytton, the foreman said. The choker chain snapped. It happened fast. That was what they told her when they rode down to deliver the news. 2 men she didn't know on horses, she didn't recognize, their hats in their hands, their faces carefully blank. It happened fast, miss. He wouldn't have felt a thing. She was 22 years old. Her brothers, Finn and little Cody, were 9 and 6. The cabin sat at the base of a granite shelf above the Thompson River, surrounded by Douglas fir so thick the sun only reached the clearing for 4 hours each afternoon. Her father had chosen the land because of the river access and the rich soil in the meadow below. He'd filed the claim himself, taken out a small loan from a man named Silas Mercer in the town of Spence's Bridge, $20 to be repaid with interest by the following spring. That spring had come and gone. So had the next one. Gerald Baird had been a proud man but a slow earner, and the debt had grown the way debt does when a man is too stubborn to ask for help. 2 weeks after the funeral, Silas Mercer had ridden up himself. He wasn't what Lenora had expected. He was neat, almost delicate-looking, with close-trimmed gray whiskers and a very fine coat. He spoke gently, the way a man does when he already knows the answer to the question he's asking. He said he was sorry about her father. He said he understood the difficulty of her situation. He said the debt now sat at $63 and that he would give her until April to resolve it. He said if she couldn't, he would be obligated with great reluctance to pursue the land. Lenora had asked him to leave. He had smiled on his way out the door, a small, patient smile, and that smile had stayed with her longer than anything else he'd said. By the time December arrived, she had $12 and a coffee tin beneath the floorboards. She'd earned it cutting and stacking cordwood for 2 neighboring homesteads and taking in mending from the Methodist minister's wife in Spence's Bridge. $12. She needed 63. On the morning of December 7th, the sky above the canyon was the color of dirty pewter, and the temperature had dropped so fast overnight that the creek below the cabin was already silencing itself beneath a gray skin of ice. Lenora wrapped her father's wool coat around her shoulders. It swallowed her whole, the hem dragging the floor, and went out to see what was left of the woodpile. She was staring at the splinters when she heard it. Not a voice, not an animal, something heavier, the slow, deliberate sound of something being dragged across frozen ground. She turned toward the stand of fir to the north of the cabin. The sound was coming from the tree line. She went back inside for her father's rifle. She found him at the base of the largest fir, face down in a dusting of overnight snow. He was a large man, broad-shouldered, dressed in a heavy Mackinaw jacket the color of a spruce tree. One of his legs was bent at an angle that made her stomach drop. There was blood, not a little, but not catastrophic, soaking through the side of the jacket above his hip. His left hand was pressed flat against the frozen ground, as though he was trying to push himself upright, and had simply run out of the means to do it. Lenora stood 10 feet back, rifle raised. "Don't move," she said. He moved anyway, but only to turn his head. One eye was swollen shut. The other was the washed-out amber of creek water in late summer, and it looked at her with an expression that was equal parts relief and exhaustion. "I'm not armed," he said. His voice was low and rough, like gravel settling. "I had a rifle, but I dropped it on the ridge. My horse spooked." "What happened to your leg?" "Came off the horse when she bolted. Hit the rock shelf pretty hard." He exhaled slowly. "I think it's broken." "Where'd the blood come from?" A pause. "Someone put a knife in me, up near the switchbacks." Lenora stared at him. She thought about the cabin. The 4 potatoes, the $12, the 2 boys inside still in bed, still shivering. She thought about what her father would have done. She lowered the rifle. His name was Corbett Ward. He told her that much on the way to the cabin, or rather, during the long and painful process of getting him there. He was heavy in the way working men are. Not fat, but dense. His body built from years of outdoor labor. Getting him across 30 yards of frozen ground with a broken right leg and a knife wound in his side was the hardest thing Lenora Baird had ever done, and she had once pulled a calf out of a snowdrift at midnight, with no help and no light but a lantern. She fashioned a sled from the cabin's wooden shutter, laid him on it, and dragged. He didn't make a sound, which she later understood was because he was working too hard to stay conscious to have any energy left for noise. Then met them at the door wide-eyed. Little Cody hid behind him, clutching the ear of a stuffed cloth rabbit their mother had sewn before she passed. "Is he dead?" Cody whispered. "Not yet," Lenora said. "Get away from the door." She and Finn managed to get Corbett Ward onto the rope-strung cot near the stove. She sent Finn for clean water and set about assessing the damage with the same brisk, nauseated practicality she brought to all things she did not want to do, but had to. The leg she splinted with 2 flat boards from the woodshed and strips torn from a linen flour sack. The knife wound was cleaner than she'd feared, a slash rather than a thrust. The blade had skated along his lowest rib, but it needed to be cleaned and bound. She did it with a bottle of liniment she'd been hoarding for winter, and strips from the same flour sack, working quickly because her hands were steady when she worked quickly, and less steady when she had time to think. He was conscious through most of it, which she hadn't expected. When she pressed the liniment-soaked cloth to the wound, his whole body went rigid, a sound escaping through his clenched teeth that wasn't quite a word. "Hold still," she said. "Yes, ma'am," he managed. He was pale and shaking by the time she finished, but he stayed awake. She propped him up against the cabin wall and gave him water from the tin cup. He drank 3 full cups without stopping. "Thank you," he said. "Don't thank me yet," Lenora said. "That leg's going to hurt worse tomorrow." He almost smiled. "I believe you." The fever came that night, as she'd expected it would. It wasn't severe. He sweated through it by morning, but she sat up beside the stove, keeping the fire burning with the last of the good-sized pieces, and watching his chest rise and fall and listening to what he said when he wasn't quite awake. He said a name she didn't recognize. He said the survey. He said Mercer, and that was when she set down her mending and looked at him differently. When the fever broke just before dawn, he lay still for a moment, staring at the low ceiling. Then he turned his head and found her sitting on the barrel beside the stove. "You've been there all night," he said. "Someone had to watch the fire." He accepted this. "How long was I out?" 6 hours or so. The fever broke. She paused. "You talked in your sleep." His eyes moved to her face. "What did I say?" "You said the survey and Mercer." She kept her voice level. "Silas Mercer." Something shifted in his expression. He was quiet for a moment, and she could see him deciding something. "How do you know Silas Mercer?" he asked. "He holds the note on this land. My father borrowed money from him before he died. Mercer comes up here every month to remind me." She pulled the coat tighter around her shoulders. "He wants this property. He's made that very clear." Corbett Ward looked at her steadily. "He wants all the properties along this stretch of river." "I know. He's been buying up every homestead from here to Ashcroft. Half the families who were here 2 years ago are gone." "He's not buying them," Corbett said. "Not all of them." Lenora waited. "I'm a land surveyor. I work for the provincial government out of New Westminster. I was up in this valley doing a routine resurvey of the river corridor." He stopped, adjusting his position against the wall with a wince. "What I found is that Mercer has been filing amended plats with the land registry. False ones. He's been shifting property lines on paper to fold adjacent homesteads into parcels he already owns. Then he calls in whatever debt he can manufacture and takes the physical title. By the time anyone tries to fight it, the amended survey is already on record, and the deed reflects Mercer's version." Lenora stared at him. "He fabricated the surveys." "Yes, and I have the original government surveys, the field notes, and 3 months of comparative measurements that prove it." He looked toward his Mackinaw jacket, hung near the stove to dry. "It's all in the oilskin pouch in my inside pocket. I was on my way back down to the wire station at Spence's Bridge to telegraph New Westminster when someone came after me on the switchback trail." "Mercer's man," Lenora said. "I don't know who hired him. But there are only a handful of people who knew I was up here, And the man who told me to start in this valley was Mercer himself. He requested the resurvey. I thought at the time it was peculiar. Landowners don't usually invite government surveyors unless they need a boundary dispute settled. Now I understand why. He wanted to know exactly what I was finding before the province did. The stove crackled. Outside, the wind moved through the firs. He tried to have you killed, Lenora said. It wasn't a question. Someone did. She was quiet for a moment. And the survey documents, if they reach New Westminster. Every false plat Mercer has filed gets voided. Every property line he manufactured goes back to the original. Everyone he's foreclosed on illegally gets their land back. Corbett's jaw tightened. But if those documents disappear, or if I disappear, there's no record. It's just a government surveyor who never came back down from the mountains. Happens in the winter. Lenora looked at the oilskin pouch hanging inside his jacket. She thought about Silas Mercer's patient smile. She thought about $12 in a coffee tin and $63 owed. She thought about her father. Gerald Baird, she said quietly. My father, he died in November. A logging accident, they said. He had borrowed money from Mercer and he wouldn't sell the land even after Mercer started pushing. Corbett looked at her carefully. I'm sorry. He was healthy, Lenora said. He was 41 years old, and he'd been logging since he was 15. The men who told me what happened, I'd never seen them before. They said the choker chain snapped. She paused. My father inspected his equipment every morning. He was particular about it. Something passed between them that didn't need to be named. I'll get those documents to New Westminster, Corbett said. You have a broken leg. It's a clean break. Give it a week. Lenora gave him 5 days, because that was how long they could reasonably stretch the oats. She took stock on the second morning, 4 potatoes, which she sliced thin and fried with the last of the salt pork. She gave the larger portions to Finn and Cody and told Corbett she wasn't hungry, which was mostly true and partly a lie. He was watching her carefully by then, and she could tell he'd noticed. On the second afternoon, he asked Finn to bring him a stick from the kindling pile. Finn brought 4, because he was 9 years old and couldn't see why one would be enough. Corbett sat up on the cot and, working slowly and one-handed, showed the boy how to whittle a proper point on the largest one. He had a folding knife in his trouser pocket. Lenora had let him keep it, having concluded that a man who hadn't used it when she found him alone and half-conscious in the snow was probably not going to use it now. Dan watched with his mouth slightly open, the way he always looked when he was genuinely concentrating, and by evening he had produced something that resembled a very rough tent peg, and was inordinately proud of it. Cody, who'd been watching from behind the rabbit for 2 days, finally abandoned his post and sat down on the floor beside the cot. Have you ever seen a bear? He asked Corbett, without preamble. More than once, Corbett said. What do you do? Depends on the bear. Corbett thought about it. Black bear, you make yourself big. Grizzly, you do the opposite. You make yourself very small, and you don't run and you wait. Cody considered this with great seriousness. Did you ever wait for a grizzly? Once. For about 40 minutes. Longest 40 minutes of my life. What happened? He decided I wasn't interesting enough and left. Corbett's mouth curved slightly. I took that personally for about 3 seconds and then I decided to take it as a compliment. Cody giggled. A sudden, bright sound that startled him as much as it startled Lenora, and she turned back to the stove so he wouldn't see her face. That night she set 2 rabbit snares along the creek, both of them held by morning. She came back in with a brace of snowshoe hares and a feeling of moderate triumph, and when she put the stew on, Corbett looked at her from the cot with an expression she didn't entirely know how to read. You set those in the dark, he said. The moon was up. Still. It's just snares, Lenora said, and ladled the stew. On the 4th evening, the boys were asleep, and the cabin was quiet except for the fire and the wind outside, and Corbett asked her how long she'd been managing on her own. 11 weeks, she said. Before that? She looked at the fire for a moment. My mother died when Cody was 3, so 9 years more or less. My father was good, but he was away in the camps a lot. I did the garden, the preserves, the mending, the schooling. She picked up her sewing. I don't say that to complain. I say it because it's the fact of things. I believe you, Corbett said. He was quiet for a moment. My sister raised 4 younger ones after our mother passed. She never complained about it either. I don't think that means it wasn't hard. Lenora glanced at him. He was looking at the fire, not at her. What does a land surveyor do when he isn't getting stabbed in mountain passes? She asked. The corner of his mouth moved. Maps, mostly. I walk places and write down what I see. Rivers, elevation, tree lines, rock formations. I make records of things the way they actually are, as opposed to the way people claim they are. That sounds like useful work. It is, until someone decides they'd rather you didn't. On the fifth morning, the sky to the west was still heavy with cloud, but the wind had dropped. Corbett stood up for the first time with the help of the broom handle she'd brought him, and took 3 careful steps across the cabin and 3 back. He was white around the mouth by the time he sat back down. But he sat down under his own power. I can make it to Spence's Bridge, he said. You can make it to the door. Spence's Bridge is 12 miles. 10.5. On a broken leg, in December. He looked at her steadily. I'm not asking you to come. I know you're not. She went back to the stove. I'll cut you a proper crutch this afternoon. She did cut him a crutch. She also put on her father's coat the next morning, packed 2 days of dried rabbit and cold biscuit into the canvas satchel, and told Finn to keep the fire going and not to open the door for anyone. Finn was 9 and serious-faced, and she trusted him absolutely. Are you coming back? Cody asked from the bed. Yes, she said. Keep Finn honest. She and Corbett set out into the gray December morning, moving slowly down the canyon trail toward Spence's Bridge. He was better than she'd expected on the crutch. Not fast, but steady, and he didn't complain. They didn't talk much. The canyon was quiet and immense around them, the river running black and silver below the trail, the firs standing black against the white slopes. After a while, Corbett said, You don't have to do this. Someone needs to carry the satchel, Lenora said, and keep watch. Your depth perception is still off, your eyes still half swollen. He didn't argue. She walked slightly ahead, watching the trail above and below. They were 4 miles out from Spence's Bridge when the man stepped out of the trees. He was lean and weathered, with a face like a hatchet and eyes that moved to Corbett first and then to Lenora in a way she disliked intensely. He held a rifle in the crook of his arm with the ease of someone who had been holding rifles for a long time. Thought you were dead, the man said to Corbett. Not yet, Corbett said. Mercer'd like to fix that. I know. Corbett stopped walking. He stood very still, his weight on the crutch. And the paper's with me. That's the real issue. The man's eyes moved to the canvas satchel on Lenora's shoulder. Hand it over and the two of you walk the rest of the way down on your own. That's a generous offer, Corbett said, for a man standing alone on a trail in December. I'm not. Lenora threw the satchel off the trail as far into the trees on the uphill side as she could, and then she stepped sideways and leveled her father's rifle at the man's chest. She'd carried it slung on her back the entire walk, and she'd had 4 miles to decide how she would use it if she needed to. The man stared at her. Get out of the way, Lenora said. He looked at the rifle. He looked at her face. He looked at Corbett, who was watching quietly. Then he stepped back off the trail and into the trees, and she heard him moving away through the brush, fast and inelegant. And then she heard nothing at all. Corbett was looking at her. The satchel, he said. I know where it landed. I'll get it. She retrieved the oilskin pouch from the snow-covered brush on the uphill slope. The papers were dry, wrapped 3 times in the oilskin. She put it back in the canvas satchel, settled it on her shoulder, and looked at Corbett. Ready? She said. He was quiet for a moment. You've done this before. Decided something quickly and then done it. I've never thrown a surveyor's documents into a snowbank before. You know what I mean. Lenora adjusted the satchel strap. Let's keep walking. They reached Spence's Bridge as the light was going out of the sky. The telegraph office was still open. The operator, a young man named Reggie with cold sores on his lip and ink on his fingers, looked alarmed at the state of both of them. Corbett dictated the telegram himself, and Lenora stood beside him and read every word of it over his shoulder, because she decided that was her right. The reply from New Westminster came the following morning while they were sleeping in the chairs in the operator's office. Reggie had refused to turn them out and quietly brought them each a blanket and a mug of tea, which Lenora had thought was the finest thing she'd seen in months. The reply said a provincial land inspector would arrive in 7 days. Silas Mercer was arrested 11 days later at his office in Spence's Bridge by 2 officers from the provincial police. The charges covered survey fraud, unlawful foreclosure, and 2 counts of conspiracy to commit assault that the inspector, a careful and thorough man named Alderton, had uncovered in Mercer's own correspondence. Lenora wasn't there when they took him out. She was back at the cabin, splitting what was left of the kindling, when Corbett came up the canyon trail. He walked without the crutch. He was slower on his right leg than he'd been before, and she suspected he'd always be slightly slower. But he was upright and moving under his own power, and he was carrying a paper sack of provisions from the Spence's Bridge store. She could see the shape of it from 30 yards away. She kept splitting wood. "Mercer's been taken in," Corbett said when he reached the clearing. "I heard from the minister's wife this morning." Lenora set the axe head on the chopping block. "The provincial office sent a letter. The original survey lines are reinstated. The amended plats are voided." "Yes." He set the sack of provisions on the porch railing. "And the fraudulent note against your father's land is part of the evidence file. There's no debt on this property, Lenora. Not legally, not morally." She looked at the cabin. At the new glass in the east window. She put it in last week with money from the $12 in the coffee tin because the original had cracked in the cold, and she decided that was the best use of the money she had. At the woodpile, which was adequate now, since Corbett had spent 3 afternoons doing what he could with one good leg, while Finn handled the splitting. She didn't say anything for a moment. "Finn," she called. Her brother appeared in the doorway. "Yeah?" "Tell Cody Mr. Ward brought provisions." Finn disappeared. The sound of small feet crossed the cabin floor at speed. Corbett was still standing in the clearing, watching her. He had his hat in his hands. "I'll be going back to New Westminster soon," he said, "once the inspector is finished with my testimony. A week, maybe 2. Lenora picked up the axe again. "You've still got maps to make, I expect." "I do." He was quiet. "There's a surveyor position opening up in the Caribou District next spring. Government post. The applicant needs field experience, which I have. It also requires someone with," he paused, choosing the word steadiness, good judgment under pressure. Lenora split a piece of kindling and stacked it. "That's a strange thing to bring up when you're about to leave," she said. "It's a 2-person job," Corbett said. "Officially, survey team. The second position is classified as field assistant, but the actual work is map reading, note keeping, and watching the trail while the other person is busy with theodolite." He paused, which someone with good eyes and a steady hand could do. Lenora set another piece of wood on the block. "The boys would need to be sorted," she said after a moment. "There's a school near the Caribou station. A real one. Better than what's here." She stood with the axe in both hands, looking at the trail beyond the clearing, the snow-dusted firs, the gray granite of the canyon walls above. She had been in this valley her whole life. She had stacked wood and set snares and stretched oats and held this small piece of land together through 2 years of grief and cold and relentless arithmetic. Her father had loved this land. But her father, she was beginning to understand, had not died in a logging accident. She looked at Corbett. "The boys come with us," she said. "Obviously," Corbett said. Inside the cabin, Cody had apparently discovered the provisions and was announcing their contents to Finn in a running commentary of increasing excitement. The word molasses was delivered with a reverence usually reserved for prayer. Lenora set the axe against the chopping block and picked up the armload of kindling. The spring thaw came 6 weeks later, earlier than any winter she could remember, as though the canyon itself had decided it was done with cold. The snow went off the meadow below the cabin in 3 days, and the dark soil of her father's planting fields appeared beneath it, rich and waiting and no longer hers to worry about. She left it in good hands. The Harrington family, 2 claims north, had been looking for more acreage since their 3rd child arrived, and the sale price was fair and square, and witnessed by the circuit magistrate in Spence's Bridge. The deed was clean. Everything was clean. On the morning they left, Lenora stood on the porch for a moment while Corbett loaded the last of their things into the rented wagon, and Finn argued with Cody about where the rabbit ought to ride. The canyon was loud with snow melt and bird song, the firs black against a sky that was, for the first time in months, an uncomplicated blue. She thought about her father. about the careful way he had inspected his equipment every morning, and the choker chain, and the two men with blank faces who had ridden down to tell her it happened fast. She thought about the look on the land inspector's face when he'd shown her the pages of Mercer's correspondence, the careful, cold calculations of a man who had decided that other people's lives were line items. Mercer would stand trial in the spring. The inspector had told her the evidence was comprehensive. She had told the inspector everything she knew about her father's death. He had written it all down. Lenora. Corbett was at the base of the porch steps, looking up at her. He had learned not to rush her when she was thinking, which she appreciated. "Coming," she said. She picked up her father's coat from the porch railing, folded it once, and laid it over the saddle rail of the wagon. She'd have no use for something that large in the caribou. But she couldn't bring herself to leave it inside. Some things you carry for a while, not because they're useful, but because they're true. Finn was already on the wagon seat with the reins, sitting very straight and trying to look experienced. Cody had wedged the rabbit into the corner of the wagon bed and was explaining to it, quietly and at length, what a theodolite was, based on his current understanding, which was largely invented. Corbett offered his hand to help her up. She looked at the hand, and then at him, and then she took it. Not because she needed the help, and she was fairly sure he knew that too, but because some things you reach for when they're offered, and you don't wait until you need them, because by then, it's usually too late. The wagon moved down the canyon trail, out of the shadow of the granite walls and into the pale winter light of the open valley, and the river ran beside them, clear and cold and going in the same direction, the way rivers do when the season finally changes and everything that was frozen begins, slowly, to move. I keep thinking about the moment Lenora found Corbett Ward face down in the snow. She had 4 potatoes. She had 2 small brothers depending on her. She had every practical reason to turn around and walk back to that cabin and pretend she hadn't seen anything. She didn't. And I don't think that was accidental. I think it was the direct result of who she had already decided to be, long before that December morning, because the truth about character is that it doesn't form in the big moments. It forms in the hundreds of small ones. The morning you get up and do the work anyway. The evening you give the larger portion to someone smaller. The years you hold things together quietly, without being asked and without being thanked. Lenora had been building herself into that person since she was 13 years old. By the time the test arrived, she was ready for it, even though she didn't know a test was coming. That's the thing about integrity. It isn't a decision you make when everything's on the line. It's the accumulated weight of every smaller decision that came before. And then there's what she did with what she knew. When Corbett told her about the false surveys, about Mercer's manufactured deaths and forged property lines, Lenora didn't panic and she didn't fall apart. She listened. She asked the right questions. She looked at the oilskin pouch and understood immediately what it meant and what it was worth and what needed to happen next. That kind of thinking, clear, practical, undeceived, doesn't come from luck. It comes from a mind that has been solving real problems in real conditions for years. She knew the terrain. She knew the law. She knew what a choker chain failure looks like when a man maintains his equipment like a point of pride. She put it together because she'd never stopped paying attention. I think about Mercer, too. A man who was clever enough to construct an elaborate fraud across an entire river valley, patient enough to play it out over years, careful enough to request the very survey that would expose him, thinking he could control what it found. He had resources. He had influence. He had a very fine coat. What he didn't have was Lenora standing at the end of a canyon trail in December with her father's rifle and the absolute refusal to be outmaneuvered on her own ground. Cleverness, without conscience, is just a longer route to the same collapse. And that's the part that stays with me. Mercer's scheme didn't unravel because of bad luck. It unraveled because he'd built it on other people's suffering. And suffering eventually produces exactly the kind of stubborn, clear-eyed resistance he hadn't accounted for. What Lenora had, what carried her through 11 weeks of grief and hunger and impossible arithmetic, wasn't hope in the soft sense. It was something tougher than that. It was the refusal to stop, the understanding that the next thing, whatever it was, still needed doing, and that she was still the one who could do it. She kept going not because she was certain it would work out, but because stopping wasn't something she knew how to justify. That's the part I find myself returning to, long after the story ends. Not the resolution, not the contract or the clear debt or the wagon moving out of the canyon in spring light, but the image of her, alone on the porch in the dark, cutting splints from flat boards, solving the next problem and then the one after that. That's what it actually looks like, most of the time. Not dramatic, not witnessed. Just someone who decided a long time ago what kind of person they were going to be, and then kept on being it even when no one was watching and the outcome was far from certain.